So for this, I want to take you all the way to the to ages, to years back, and this is when the Hatha Yoga Pradapika was written, which is a 15th century manuscript on the yoga. And if you see in it, there is a line which is mentioned. There's a verse which is mentioned, which says, "Amrit, the liquid of immortality, is like nectar. It exudes from the Chandra center in the center of the head, deep behind the eyebrows. Who swallows this clear liquor, dripping from the brain into the heart and obtained by means of meditation, becomes free from disease and tender in the body like the stalk of a lotus and will live a very long life." So these words mention a liquid, Amrita, or Amrit as it's called in India. So Amrit literally means immortality. And they also talk about, these words also talk about something in the center of the head. So what is in the center of our head, in the center of our brains, is the third ventricle. So the cerebrospinal fluid is inside our brains, outside our brains, inside our spinal cord and outside our spinal cord. Literally, our brains and our spinal cord is bathed in this fluid. And inside our brains, in the center, is the third ventricle, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So do these words signal to the cerebrospinal fluid? It very well could be. Today, in today's modern times, we are calling it the cerebrospinal fluid, and perhaps at that particular time, in the 15th century, it was called Amrit, or the liquid of immortality. And that is why many traditions refer to this particular center as something extremely special. The yogis call it a cave of Brahma. You may have heard the word seat of the soul. Some people refer to it as seat of the soul. It's also referred to, as some traditions call it, the third eye, though some traditions call the pineal gland the third eye, some call the pituitary the third eye, but a lot of traditions call the third ventricle, which is the center of your brain, as the third eye. So you have different traditions. The Taoists call this the crystal palace. So different traditions calling the same space as something very, very special in that sense. So is this what they're referring to, the cerebrospinal fluid? It very well could be. Why do I say that? For that, I want to talk to you about the Kechari Mudra, which is from the world of yoga. So the Kechari Mudra, as you can see in this particular slide, which is there, is a yogic practice. And this is developed over months and years it takes to perfect this particular practice, in which the tongue is rolled up to touch the soft palate. From there, it is inserted into the nasal cavity, and as you can imagine, it takes months or years of practice. And once it's inside the nasal cavity, the tongue can stimulate nerve centers that are connected to the brain, which produce a liquid that emanates from the roof of the cavity. A nectar, or you can call it Amrit, flows from the roof of the nasal cavity. So what is in the nasal cavity? The nasal cavity, as you see in this picture, this is the olfactory bulb. This is where at the olfactory bulb, something very spectacular happens. What is it? That is one of the spots in your brain where the blood-brain barrier is breached. So the cerebrospinal fluid can effectively bypass the blood-brain barrier here and can come out. And perhaps this is what the yogis are trying to stimulate, trying to connect to through the Kechari Mudra. So this particular mudra also is something which talks about the cerebrospinal fluid very, very directly. So that's why I feel that in addition to the yoga, the practice of yoga being so empowering, it could also be the cerebrospinal fluid, and that will become more clear when I share some of the things which the cerebrospinal fluid does for us. But before that, one more thing that I want to share about the cerebrospinal fluid, about why it's so powerful and why the yogis gave it so much of significance, is also because if you look at the world of yoga, we have the word namaste, which basically a lot of places you will hear that this signifies the light in me honors the light in you. And when I honor the light in me, which is in you, we are one, signifying we are one, right? So this light that is being spoken about. And then you look at the cerebrospinal fluid. So as I told you, the cerebrospinal fluid is housed in the ventricles in your brain. Now these ventricles have receptors on them. So they have chemical receptors which basically are responsible for growth factors which are released into So there are these growth factors which are released into the cerebrospinal fluid. When are they released? Not just when you are conceived. So the cerebrospinal fluid in your bodies has been with you since your birth. So it's a very, very fascinating process. So when you were just a sheet of cells, just imagine at one point of time, we were all just a sheet of cells and in our mother's womb and surrounded by fluid, the amniotic fluid. And then this sheet of cells folds into itself and forms like a donut. Now, inside the donut, the fluid, which was once the amniotic fluid, now is inside and now is called the cerebrospinal fluid. So it was a amniotic fluid in that sense, is the amniotic fluid, but now that it's inside, it's now being termed as the cerebrospinal fluid. And this donut then elongates, and that forms your spinal cord, and at one side is your brain, which forms. So that's the beginning of the embryo in that sense. So when you go back to your absolutely beginning as in this body stage, you will see that the cerebrospinal fluid was even there that time. And it is through the growth factors which are released into the cerebrospinal fluid, which give information to the neural stem cells. For what? For proliferation, how much to develop. So you need more cells because the embryo is becoming bigger and bigger. Now you have cells needed for different functions. So not only do we need more cells, we need them to differentiate. Some may become heart, some may become part of the eye, some may become the hands. So proliferation and differentiation. All this is thanks to all this information which is there with the cerebrospinal fluid. So these growth factors, ions, hormones are getting released in. So you have these chemical receptors on the walls of the ventricles which tell us that yes, there are these growth factors being released. You also have mechanoreceptors which tell us that mechanoreceptors are for the flow. In fact, it's so fascinating to see there was a study done with rats in which they found out that the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid actually directs the neural stem cells to go where they're supposed to go. What do I mean by that? In this fascinating study with the rats, they found out that rats can regenerate their olfactory bulb. So the neural stem cells were being directed through the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid towards the olfactory bulb where they could have gone and regenerated it. Something even more fascinating about the cerebrospinal fluid and the neural stem cells is that if you keep the neural stem cells in a petri dish in the lab, in just the cerebrospinal fluid, they will stay only as neural stem cells. But when you have some other media being introduced, then they start differentiating into other cells. So if you want to retain the neural stem cells as neural stem cells, so not only are they retained as neural stem cells, but now when they divide, and if they are only in the cerebrospinal fluid, they divide as only neural stem cells. Can you imagine? That's a bank of neural stem cells, that we would have with us. So that is the power of the cerebrospinal fluid, and so much more. And about the light that I mentioned, the namaste that I mentioned, the light in you honors the light in you. Well, the ventricles, the walls of the ventricles, in addition to having chemical receptors, mechanoreceptors, also have light receptors. That means the cerebrospinal fluid can actually carry light, vibration, movement, flow, growth factors, ions, energy, so many things it can carry. So do you think this light which is being spoken about in the Namaste is signifying to the light which the cerebrospinal fluid could carry? And the presence of the light receptors tells us that yes, it can. And those of us who work with the cerebrospinal fluid can testify to this, that yes, that uncreated light is experienced. In fact, you have the Jyoti Mudra in the world of yoga. Jyoti literally means light. So when you practice different techniques, breath techniques and different other mudras and kriyas on the cerebrospinal fluid, and you also do the Jyoti Mudra, you can actually get to experience the uncreated light within you. And can you imagine the amount of feeling of empowerment that it can give you in that sense? So perhaps this is where Dandamus's strength is coming from, the light that he gets to witness on a daily basis. And last but not the least, the cerebrospinal fluid is also water, 99% water. And water, as you know, has the power to carry energy, to carry information, as some of the experiments done by the Japanese scientist Masaru Emoto has shown, Veda Austin has shown, Dean Reardon has been replicating double-blind studies of the same work which Masaru Emoto has done. in which the water was crystalline and given certain words were spoken to it, and depending on the words spoken, there were crystals formed. So you have these beautiful crystals which are with beautiful words, positive words, and when the water was spoken to with words which were very, very negative in their connotation, the crystals were formed were so very different as compared to when they were formed when positive words were spoken. So we know that water carries energy, and the cerebrospinal fluid is 99% water. So it carries so much more, and it was carrying all these things when we were born, and we also I definitely am sure that it carries even now. And when you start connecting to this extremely empowering fluid, the kind of strength which it gives you, it's amazing. So perhaps this is where the strength of Dandamis is coming from. And then you have the work of Dr. Pollack to show us about the fourth phase of water, in which you can actually activate water. In fact, you may have seen that infrared saunas have become pretty popular nowadays. That's because infrared has shown to be able to activate water. And as we just shared that 99% of the cerebrospinal fluid, 99% is water, then can we activate the fourth phase of water in cerebrospinal fluid, whether through tuning force, crystal bowls? So that also is going to be something which is so fascinating, because that adds to the sheer power, the sheer potential of this extremely empowering fluid which is within us, inside our brains, inside our spinal cords, outside our spinal cords, outside our brains, literally bathing them in this particular extremely powerful fluid. I want to share here with you that in the end of April, I have a workshop which is coming up, which is going to be on just this topic. And of course, we're going to get in resourcing from the world of somatic EMDR. We're going to get in the felt sense from this world of somatic EMDR. We're also going to be talking about these yogic techniques, which we are going to be getting a little more in depth in as compared to this particular podcast. But if this is a topic which interests you, I'll leave the details in the description box, in the written matter for this particular podcast. If you're interested, please feel free to explore it, and we would love if you can join us there. This is a beautiful, fascinating topic which can really, it has the potential to make you feel so empowered, just like, Dandamis. Somebody might say that, oh, he didn't fear death. So do you think I'm going to jump in front of a car now that tomorrow, just because I'm now feeling fearless about death? No, you're going to take it seriously, but you're not going to take it literally. It's not going to make you paranoid. You want the body to survive. You know that the body is governed by certain principles in this physical reality. So if it is struck by a car, it is going to have a little bit of damage. So you may want to say, okay, fair enough, I don't want to do that. But you don't get paranoid about it. So tomorrow when a challenge occurs, you see it in a different light. It's like that very famous example from the school of Vedanta, which I have often shared in a lot of my podcasts. Let's say you are walking and you see a rope, but because it's dark, you see it as a snake, and when you shine the light of awareness, then you realize, oh, it's just a rope, but it seemed like a snake. So a challenge which comes up in life, and all of us have challenges, small, big, could be anything, but it depends a lot on how you perceive it, because it's your life, So say there's a challenge which comes up, but then you can actually, without getting paranoid about it, see it, and therefore are able to go through it and come to the solution part of it in a much more easier way. Then perhaps you may like to do that, as compared to, getting absolutely seeing it as a struggle in that sense.